So I'm Tom, Marquita's behind the camera, and we are destined to explore. I just finished up the final torque on the wheels after doing the bearing change and then driving the designated distances. I'll tell you that this was the first time that I've ever repacked wheel bearings on a trailer this big. I got the confidence to do that by going to some Dexter Axel seminars at a recent national rally that we were at. And what I can tell you is it wasn't real difficult. It was slightly time consuming and messy, but really it's a job that just about anyone could do if you've got a little bit of patience and willing to get your hands dirty. And I think it probably saved us $600 repacking the bearings ourselves. And I know that they're done correctly and that they're torqued to, they're set to factory specifications. So take a look at the video. Hopefully this helps you out. We'll see you down the road. We're going to repack the bearings on the trailer at, I don't know, 9,000 miles, and they recommend doing it every, I think 10 or 12,000 miles, or once a year, whichever comes first. So what we've done so far here is we've parked the trailer, we've lifted it with the leveling jacks. So if you ever talk to Lippert, they will tell you absolutely not to lift your trailer with leveling jacks and lift it that way. The jacks have plenty of capacity to do that. But what you would never want to do is lift it with the jacks and then crawl underneath, because you can't trust those. So we're going to do one wheel at a time. So if the jacks were to fail for some reason, the other wheel will hold the trailer up. So we're not in danger of getting crushed or anything, and we're also not crawling underneath at all. So the benefit of being at home and doing this is I have an air compressor and air tools, which makes the job a little easier. If we were out on a campground or traveling someplace, we could easily do this with a big breaker bar. But this just makes the job go a little quicker here. Alright, so the tire is going to come off. So we have a Dexter 7,000 pound axle, and we have Kodiak disc brakes, which are made by Dexter as well. In order to get the wheel off, we got to take the brake off. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to support the brake when it comes off with this bucket, because it's on a hydraulic line here, and what we don't want to do is just hang that brake in the air by that hydraulic line. So this is just, on this particular one, it's just a 1/2 inch bolt. So that's out. This one's coming off pretty easy, but the other one, the first one that I did, needed a little bit of encouragement with a rubber mallet, so that's fairly easy. And then, unlike most of the wheels that you would see, most of them have like a metal cap on here that needs to be pried off, but this is just a big plastic cap. That one's quite loose. That just spins off. So that makes that kind of easy. In here there's a retaining clip that holds the nut in the proper position. So a lot of brakes would have like a cotter pin that goes through a little, they call it a castle nut. It's a nut that's got slots in it, but we have just a retaining clip, so it's a little more, allows you a little more precise adjustment. And that just pops off. And then inside here there's a big nut, and that should just be finger tight is all, so that should just spin right off. So we can drop that in there. And then inside here there's a washer, which doesn't necessarily pull off real easy, but what we want to do is we want to pull this whole disc off of here. We need to hold our hand over this side of the disc, because this bearing can fall out, and what you don't want to do is you don't want to drop that bearing on the ground because that can damage the bearing. So we're just going to twist a little bit there. That bearing's trying to fall out, and I can drop that bearing in the box, and then we'll flip it over, and this is the other bearing here, and there's a seal in here that keeps everything out, so we just need to pry that off. The seals are going to get thrown away, and we've got new seals to put in. There we go. That can go in the garbage. The other bearing is on the back side here, which we're going to lift out of there. So one of the interesting things that I learned at the Dexter seminars at the RV rally was, you can see down in here there's grease down in here, and there's grease around the outside. That grease is never going to get used. The grease that we're using is Lucas Oil Red and Tacky, number 2 I think it's called. And so the only grease that's actually going to get used is the grease that's packed into this bearing, unless this whole assembly heats up to something like 450 degrees, which you don't want to ever happen. The grease isn't going to move around in here at all. It's just going to stay, what's in this bearing is what's going to get used. The other thing you can notice here, if you look closely, is, here's red and tacky red grease, and here it's kind of brown. And so that's the big reason why we want to change these, is because as this wears in here, you're going to get some metal particulate in here. So that's why we want to change the grease, so we get all that out of there nice and clean and everything's running really well. The other thing to note here is this bearing and this race go together, and you don't ever want to mix them. So we wouldn't want to take that wheel and put the back bearing from that wheel into this wheel, because these basically wear together. So if you ever have to replace a bearing, you also have to replace the race. So that they're matched. So now that we've been running these for a year or more or whatever, they should be worn in together, so they should wear probably less. So the next time it would be interesting to see if we have this much brown stuff in here, because that's kind of the debris and stuff that we're kind of trying to clean out. So we're gonna go ahead and get these all cleaned up, and then we'll go on from there. So I'm just going to take the paper towel, and the race wipes out pretty easily. There's some brown in there, and we just want to inspect these races in here just to make sure there's not any pitting or discolorization in there, dark spots, and these look really nice, so I'm not too concerned about those. We'll do the same thing on the other side. And I'm not going to worry about the other grease that's down in the middle of the hub down there. Like I said, that's not going to move around. It's still real clean, good grease in there, and that's not going to move around unless things got really hot, which they shouldn't ever do. So that's the hub cleaned up. Then we're going to start on the bearings here, and I'm just going to start by wiping as much gunk off of them as I can. So the other thing we're going to use here is just brake cleaner. It's just a really good solvent for cleaning. We're just going to use it for the bearings here, so I'm just going to start off by so this is just a process of spraying the brake cleaner or the degreasing solvent in there, and we just want to keep doing that until we get everything cleaned out of there. Certainly you wouldn't need to have a blowgun like this to clean it, but I find it just helps. Since we have it at home, we're going to use it. The other two wheels I went through a whole can of this on the two wheels, so I'm planning to have quite a bit of brake cleaner for this to clean it. So we're not really getting any other gunk out the other side there, so we're going to call that one good. I'm going to dry it off on the outside one more time here. And then I'm going to use the compressed air to blow this out and get everything dried out so all that solvent is gone. The other thing you never want to do, according to the Dexter sessions that I went to, is you never want to use the air gun and just blow the bearing like this and spin it. You can actually damage the bearing that way apparently, so we're just going to hold it. It would also be important to have a pair of safety glasses on, because I just blew a chunk of grease right off the bearing and up into onto my glasses. So once we've got this bearing completely cleaned, we want to go and inspect all of the rollers here. And again, we're looking for any pits or any discoloration. This bearing looks really nice, so we're going to call that one good. And then we'll set that aside, and then we'll clean up the inner bearing, or the inside bearing, and then we'll start looking at the rest of it here, I guess. I'll wipe off the nut, get any old grease off of that, clean off the washer. And clean off the shaft here. Let's wipe this off a little more here. I'm going to spray a little brake cleaner on here so you don't spray it all over the ground. Now this axle has something that a lot of trailers have, and there's a grease zerk on the outside, and this is called an easy lube. So you can actually just take the cap off the hub. You can put a grease gun on here and you can pump grease in, and what happens is that grease comes out this little hole right here. So the mistake that some people might make is, if they're trying to use this, I don't know that I would recommend doing that first off, because you're just going to push all the bad grease through the axle to the front bearing and then all out the front, and you're not going to get all that old grease out of there. But if you were to use that, what you want to make sure you do is when you hook this up and you've got the hub on there, because that hole is just in one location here, what you want to do is you want to be turning that wheel as you pump grease into it, and what you're actually going to do is you're going to fill that hole inside of that hub with grease. It's going to take a lot of grease to do that. So we're just going to do it this way, where we just clean it all up and just put new grease into places where it needs to go, and then we'll be good with that. So the next thing here is to re-grease the bearings. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can put a big glob of grease in your hand and mush it in here, and that's a perfectly acceptable way to do that, and a lot of people do that and probably even prefer that in some cases. But what you're trying to do is ensure that you pack grease into every little hole and crevice in this bearing. What I'm going to use is, this is a tool for greasing bearings. So we could put a link in the description below to the one we bought, but basically it's just a couple of cones here, and we're going to put that bearing in between here and screw this down and get everything nice and level and then tight, and then we're going to hook the grease gun up to this and start pumping. And what we're watching for, we're going to pump, first we're pumping the inside of that full of grease. So you can see it just squeezing out the little holes there. So that took quite a few pumps. And when we spin this off, ooh, that was close. What we end up with is a lot of grease on the inside. But we can use that to smear on the axle and a bunch of other places, so that doesn't go to waste. And the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to take some of this in here, and I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to really press it into all the bearings this way, because we want to make sure everything is packed as good as possible. And then we can take more of this and we can cover the axle really well. I'm going to put it all over the grease on the inside here. So that's pretty good. I'm going to take this bearing and drop it in there. Press it in. So then we're going to take a new seal. I want to put a little bit of, I say to put some grease in here. So then we're going to take the seal. Again, always get a new seal to put in here. Don't reuse the old ones. And we're going to drop it down into its little retaining spot. I've got a clean block of wood here. And we're just going to go on top of this. And then we're going to drive that down flush. That's down in there. And then I need to repack the second bearing. So now we're back to the disc back on here. We got grease in the front, we got the bearing in the back with the seal on it, and what we need to do now is lift this onto the axle spindle and just turn it a little bit as you put it on. It has a tendency to want to kind of fall out, so you got to kind of hold that there. We're going to take the bearing, take a little more grease and fill all the little holes in there. Now there's a washer with a flat on it that matches up with this. That's not going. There it goes. It wasn't quite on there all the way. And then there's the nut here. This is kind of the technical part that I learned at the rally and going to the sessions from Dexter. Is, you know, you'll see a lot of the YouTube videos you see on re-greasing Dexter hubs and things like that. They'll lock this down with a crescent wrench or whatever, and then they'll kind of back it off slightly. And the proper way to do this, to get it back to the factory specification, is I've got a torque wrench here, and I've got it set to about 50 foot-pounds. I have a 1.5 inch socket on the end here, and what you're supposed to do is put this on here, and while you're turning the hub, torque it to 50 pounds. You're going to take this off. There's my socket now. And put it on a socket wrench. And you're going to go in here, and you don't want this hub to spin at all. You want this to stay completely stationary. And I'm going to back it off until it's loose, and I can turn it with my fingers. So I can turn that with my fingers, and then we turn it down finger tight. And that's the factory specification for setting the bearing adjustment in there. Now if you've got a castle nut on here, you've got a cotter pin that's got to go in there. And if the cotter pin doesn't line up with a hole where it is now, you back it off just until it does. So it's probably, you know, people that do it the other way, you know, it's probably not an issue, and obviously lots of people do it that way and get just fine results. But this is the way that Dexter recommends doing it from the factory specifications. So now that it's finger tight, this allows for much greater adjustment as far as locking things in. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to press this back on here. It's slightly difficult. lock that back on there. And as you can see, this is still, there's just, you can see a little movement in that nut down there. So it won't go any farther because it locks into this flat spot on the axle. And that's factory tension to the factory specifications. So that's right. I'm just going to go ahead and just stick a little more grease in the end here. Probably not needed because, like we said, you know, this isn't going to move around in there. But that just makes sure there's everything covered with grease really well, and the nut and everything. We've got the dust cap again here. We're going to put this back on. This doesn't have to be that tight. I'm just going to use, I think it says to 10 to 20 foot-pounds, and 10 to 20 foot-pounds is not very much, so I'll just snug that up. So I'm going to put a little more blue Loctite on here to lock into where it'll bite down. Well, it's got quite a bit on it already. When I put the brakes back on here, I need to just pay attention to the way these were when I pull them off, because what I don't want to do is get them all twisted around and tight so they don't have room to move with the axle. Hopefully this will just slide back in here. There, and then I can reach around the back and put the bolts in. Put one in down below here. I don't know what the proper torque value for those are, but they weren't very tight, so I just snugged them up good. Probably tighter than they need to be. I'm going to torque down the U-bolts here. Those are supposed to be 70 to 80 pounds. So I'm just going to get on these, and that one's already tight. That one's tight. That's tight too. Maybe we already did this one at one point in time. So I'm going to make sure those are torqued down right. And the other thing is I'm going to grease the suspension. So if your wet bolt shackles aren't put in with the holes horizontal, it can be really hard to grease those zerks. So I'm going to go ahead, and as long as I got all the weight off of this, I'm going to go ahead and just pump a little bit of grease in there until I see some grease come out. Get that on there. Grease coming out of there. So the last thing is just, putting the wheel back on. A couple little points about that is, obviously when you put it on, you want to follow the bolt patterns that you would do. On here it shows, top, bottom, like this. So you kind of go around in a star pattern. I actually like to use just my little DeWalt impact driver here, and I'll just get them snugged up. And I'll go in the torque pattern. So the thing that I like about using my impact driver as opposed to an air gun is an air gun will drive it down really tight, probably over the torque specifications. This drives it pretty close to the torque specifications, but not quite. The convenience of that is that when you come back and torque it with your torque wrench, you're very close to the recommended torque values, and you just have to torque it a little bit. The other thing that Dexter recommends that probably a lot of people don't know is when you torque your tires down, what they want you to do is to drive 10 more miles on the tires, go out and retorque them again. They want you to drive 25 more miles, torque them again, and then drive 50 miles and torque them again, and then they say you should be good. So that's the other little piece about doing this here. So I hope you found this recording helpful. I did do the retorques after 10, 25, and 50 miles as recommended by Dexter. Certainly there was movement on the nuts after 10 miles, some after 25. I'm not sure I detected any after 50, so that's kind of the last specifications we got as far as the retorquing. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, give us the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you down the road.